Civilization begins in Mesopotamia. The objectives are 1. Explain how geography affected the civilizations in Mesopotamia, and 2. Describe Sumerian city-states and Sumerian forms of communication that affect our lives today. Now first, we begin with geography, just as we did in other places. The impact of geography is fundamental to the shaping of human civilizations. This is certainly true of the Mesopotamian region. Now, the two main rivers that we're talking about in Mesopotamia are the Tigris and the Euphrates rivers that really create the space or the region that we call Mesopotamia, because the Mesopotamian river valley, or literally Mesopotamia means between the rivers, is a very fertile region for the entire Middle Eastern region in that area. Now, this is part of a greater kind of formation of fertile soil called the Fertile Crescent. Now, the Fertile Crescent is a region of land extending from Egypt along the eastern Mediterranean seaboard to the Tigris and Euphrates down to the Persian Gulf. And it forms a sort of crescent shaped. And that has to do with the waterfall and the abundance of water that allows for, in long time past, natural locations for crops and migratory sheep and goats that are settling there because there's an abundance of water supply. Now, naturally, people settled there because you want to settle near water and places where there's abundant food. And so this really becomes the kind of cradle in which the first kind of people groups or civilizations arose. Now, of course, in general, there's very little rainfall, but the soil had been enriched over the years by the layers of silt deposited by these rivers, as you have, at least in Egypt, annual flooding that could be regularly predicted and depositing silt on the banks. And then Mesopotamia, while irregular, still deposited rich soil along its banks and allowed for pretty fertile soil for crop and agricultural use. So the Tigris and the Euphrates often overflowed their banks and deposited fertile silt, but this was done in an irregular fashion, and it was unclear whenever this would occur, which really leads to the psyche of the region and the perspective they had toward deity and nature in the universe. So here's a close-up of that Fertile Crescent region. You could see here in the salmon kind of peachish color that the region that we're talking about with the fertile territories where people are largely going to be settling down in great numbers very early on. Now, people in the valley, as was said, could not predict the flooding of the river. So this will, of course, impact a lot in terms of how they'll react to their environment, how they'll think about the gods and their unpredictability. Because, of course, they don't think that these gods are always have their best interest in mind. It's not a Judeo-Christian sort of ideal, but rather a temperamental deity that causes the water to flood at irregular times for various reasons. Now, farming could only be accomplished through irrigation and drainage ditches. You had to cut through furrows from the river to get the water over there using various technologies to get that water out of the river and out to the crops. And so this is going to be the major kind of approach toward farming in Mesopotamia. However, it did lead to an abundance of food that enabled the development of large civilizations in Mesopotamia, and we end up seeing some of the most early empires in global history. The Assyrians, the Akkadians, the Sumerians are the kind of notable people groups that first emerge in the region. Specifically, we'll be talking about the Sumerians here. which are really the first kind of major civilization. So the point here is that civilization is the direct result of abundant food supply and surplus that allowed for the specialization of labor and the development of cities. What caused the abundance of food? Irrigation and settling down along rivers. So that you see a major shift from the hunters and gatherers we've seen in the past. Now, in this ancient world, the kind of political unit that we need to talk about is the city-state. And the city-states of ancient Mesopotamia were numerous. By 3000 BCE, some 5,000 years ago, independent cities emerged along southern Mesopotamia, particularly in southern Mesopotamia. Erefu, Uruk, these are all city-states. Now, city-states are essentially what they sound like. It is a city in the sense that we're thinking of. Buildings with perhaps a walled system around it, a city, but it functions as its own nation. It functions as its own state. So it's its own sort of country. It's independent from any other city. All of these cities do not kind of exist or compose together to form one civilization in general, I suppose, or one kingdom, as it were, but they independently each have their own kingdoms or authorities or kingships. So in a certain sense, they are their own kind of power or nation. Now, nationalism, of course, and the concept of nations will be much, much later. But here, I guess the closest kind of word we could use is kingship. Now, of course, all of these cities in the whole region will have a lot of similarities. And so that is what will constitute a civilization. So collectively, they all form one massive civilization, the Mesopotamian civilization. Now, in terms of Sumerian cities, although Mesopotamia had little stone or wood for building purposes, they used mud brick. They used the resources that existed around them to develop their cities. So you end up with these mud kind of brick homes, but they are much more advanced than what we've seen in the past, in particularly connected to the hunters and gatherers and the settlements that they devised. Now here, of course, they are quite advanced, particularly for those who have come before. They invented the arch and the dome, which will be a huge for architecture in the future, and really will take hold in the classical world. It will largely be forgotten in the medieval, but be revitalized in the Renaissance, at least for the Western world. So the arch and the dome are huge concepts, and they really are fundamental to the shaping of architecture in the modern world, and they are invented by the Sumerians. But really, one major thing that dominated the Mesopotamian culture, and ancient cultures in general, was the concept of religion, or the gods. So the most kind of prominent building in the entire city was the temple. And it was dedicated to the chief god of that city, or the goddess for that city. Now, that temple is called a ziggurat. It is a temple atop a massive kind of stepped tower. Now, really, the temple is only at the top. At the bottom, you had all kinds of other things. You had a market, particularly for selling of animals and exchanging of animals through a barter system. You had the residence of the kings. So all those features are there, but at the top is the temple, where they're sacrificing animals to the gods. Now, each city really had its own patron deity, its own patron god that really looked over them, which is a tradition that is absorbed into Roman Catholicism with the concept of patron saints, which are sort of a quasi kind of, at least in religion, a quasi sort of deity that has power to affect your life. Well, that's essentially what the ancient gods were. So each kind of city had its own patron deity. For the Babylonians, it was Marduk. And, to go outside of Mesopotamia, for Athens, it was Athena. Even though they believed in these other gods, there was one kind of chief god that was over that city, and it was his city. Now, the temples and related buildings served as centers of the city, physically, economically, and politically. Really, they placed the ziggurat at the center of that entire economic and political system. Well, it makes sense when this is the hub for trade. This is the hub for religious activity. This is the hub for politics, right, with the kings and the kingship living there. And so, really, every kind of focal point that could exist in the Mesopotamian civilization really oscillates around the ziggurat. Now, these kingdoms were somewhat theocracies. Now, a theocracy is a government driven or controlled by divine authority. Now, they claim that they have direct ruleship underneath the deity, but it was always through the medium of a king. So the king derived their power from these deities and claimed that he derived his power from these deities. Now, here's the interesting thing, that the king needed to demonstrate and consistently show that the gods supported him. If the gods failed to support him, the king, then the people would believe that perhaps new kingships needed. And we'll see this trend play out in China, but the concept is that the king only derives authority through the deity's will or authority. Almost a Western kind of medieval divine right of kingship that will emerge. The idea that one can rule only through the authority, the blessing of the deity. So this is not a strong man, powerful, political, smarter, faster sort of explanation for leading. That may be the causation, but there's definitely a religious element to this. Now, what did the economy and society look like in general? The peoples of Mesopotamia were well known for their metalwork and for their wool and pottery. Particularly, they're well known for their copper. So Sumerians imported copper and tin, timber, and they exchanged dried fish, wool, barley, wheat, and various metal goods. Now, particularly, what kind of metal goods? They're importing copper and tin, which together form bronze. And so they're famous for their bronze work, and they're able to export that as a finished product to others, because we're well into the Bronze Age here. The Sumerians also invented the wheel, as far as we know. I mean, this is the earliest example we've seen archaeologically of a wheel. And so it seems that the Sumerians invented the wheel, which is, of course, has a huge legacy up to the present age. This was somewhere around 3000 BCE and led to wheeled carts, which eased transportation. Obviously, if you're going to barter with a neighboring tribe, you don't have to pack it all onto the back of a camel or something, but it can be loaded up into a cart pulled by that camel. So you're having a wider availability of spreading these various goods. That's just one immediate application of the wheel. But we've seen it even on children's toys that have been preserved these thousands of years. But the reality is that the Sumerians are a farming people. 90% or more of the people were farmers. So all these people that are practicing textiles and various artisan and specialized labor are really less than 10%, which really goes to show that these are the elite of the elite that are really being able to live life in this manner and to have a sort of wealthy existence, to benefit from the economic fruit of having that skilled labor. The reality is that 90% of the people below are farmers, hand to mouth, out in the day, working constantly. Farming is no easy task, especially in an ancient world. Tons of labor, hard labor, constant labor, when it was harvest or planting season. So that seems to be the normal existence of most of these people. Now we end up seeing the emergence of empire first in Mesopotamia. So as city-states expand, new conflicts arise, fighting over land and water, those kind of fundamental core resources that everyone needs to survive. And because the region geographically is flat, this, of course, opens up the entire region for invasion from one another, from one city-state to another, or from outsiders. Now, the Sumerians will fight with each other, but it's really when the Akkadians from the northern Mesopotamia, descend upon the south and conquer them, that we see the first empire. Now, these Akkadians, which are a Semitic-speaking people, they speak a Semitic language versus the Sumerians who do not, expanded under the leadership of Sargon in 2340 BCE. Now, the Akkadians and Sargon are quite violent and quite hard in terms of a militaristic society. They overrun Sumerian city-states. They establish the first empire. And the empire is technically a large political unit or state under a single leader. That's technically yes, but expanding beyond their own territory to gobble up others. That is really an empire. And so Sargon employs a lot of shock and awe in terms of his approach to military expansion. Torture and mass killings are just some among the methods that he uses to conquer other people. Now, attacks from neighboring hill peoples, of course, in the long run led to the collapse of the Akkadian Empire. And this, of course, leads to a warring period between city-states. So the Akkadians, of course, have no immunity from the same kind of methods that others had in terms of conquest. The Sumerians were conquered by the Akkadians, and the Akkadians were conquered by another group that comes in from a different region. Really, this plays into the theme of the geography. Because there's no natural barriers, it's all flat, the whole region is open. This leads to the fact that you have a constant turnover or a churning of empires and people groups. And so you're really going to have a lot of war in this region, which may, in some sense, set the tone for a long history of political conflict in the region. Now, by 1792 BCE, we see a new kind of leadership emerge from really Babylon. And Babylon really takes the region and takes authority, particularly under the ruler Hammurabi, which is really the key who we want to focus on. Hammurabi will really set a new trajectory for the Mesopotamian civilization. Now, Hammurabi is a king. You can see him on this stele here on the right, this stone artifact that was found. Hammurabi is the character on the left standing before his deity on the right, Enlil. And what he is doing here is receiving a law code from the deity. And this law code is called the Code of Hammurabi. Now, the Code of Hammurabi was based on a system of strict justice. Penalties for criminal offenses were severe, and they varied according to social class and really the social class of the victim harmed. So really some of the famous adages derive from this text and correlate to the kind of Old Testament narratives that we'll see, particularly to the law. So the idea of eye for eye and tooth for tooth is really dominant here. So the eye, if someone had say there was some kind of conflict and the eye was harmed, or the person's eye had to be removed or something like that, then we would literally have to take the other person's eye. Equal strict justice. Now, of course, where it becomes harsh and where it's based on class is that depending on who you are, that would depend upon the crime, or at least the penalty. So if you're a wealthy person and the person harmed by the crime was a poor person, then of course you would imagine that the punishment would be quite lenient. Or vice versa. If you're a poor person or a low-class person and you harmed or killed a upper-class person, then the punishment for that crime would be quite severe. So it was based around social class, but was quite harsh and focused on strict justice. So this is really the largest category of laws in the Code of Hammurabi, really focused around class systems, marriage, and really family, which is not surprising because this tends to be the biggest issue of conflict, both now and in the past. But what's important here is that Hammurabi receives this code. It reinforces the fact that the deity is giving him authority. You can see that even in the illustration here. Not everyone can read, but what was carved below is an articulation of the written law. And Enlil and Hammurabi sitting up at the top of this is kind of a graphic illustration to all those who are illiterate, that they can see that the deity is giving their king, Hammurabi, authority. Now, this society in general, then, is a patriarchal society. That is, it's controlled by men, that these sort of male deities are giving authority to males to lead the civilization and to lead the authority. And so really embedded within the Code of Hammurabi is a sort of patriarchal tone where males lead. Now, the importance of religion cannot be overstated. The physical environment strongly affected the way the Mesopotamians viewed the world, from the rivers and the flooding of the rivers to sandstorms or anything else. So what people believed when they saw the environment around them, they needed explanations for how the universe functioned. Why did storms occur? Why did that sandstorm occur? They couldn't understand it. And so they explained these things through spiritual forces. So the powerful spiritual beings that existed around them kind of permeated everything. They permeated all aspects of the universe. And for the Sumerians, there were some 3,000 gods and goddesses that existed all about them, all dedicated and connected to various aspects of the environment, from sandstorms to rivers to mountains. You'd have a god that was connected to it all. And so really what we're talking about is a polytheistic religion. That is, the belief in many gods. Poly, many, theistic gods, many gods. And so are multiple gods. So the Sumerians and the Mesopotamian civilization in general are polytheistic, and they, while these gods can't really be said to love them in any kind of sense, not in a Judeo-Christian sense, but they sought to appease these gods through sacrifice. Humans were created to serve these gods, and so they served them through offering them food, offering them the blood of animals and living creatures, anything they could do to please these gods. Now, the Sumerians in general are a fairly creative people, and they devised one of the earliest writing systems ever conceived by humans. They recognized that there was a need for developing a written kind of way of speech. And so around 3000 BCE, the Sumerians created cuneiform, which is literally means wedge-shaped, and is a system of writing by which they placed impressions on wet clay or moist clay, and particularly clay tablets, and then it hardened, and that message was left permanently in that stone, which is remarkably long-lasting, obviously, and we have tablets today from long, long ago. But really this develops out of the function or need for religion and economics. So writing really became an important aspect to the society to keep records and to pass along knowledge. So particularly we see the economic records for trade, for business. You'll really see this centered around the ziggurat. But where it becomes quite interesting is we see the conveyance of law, right? That has to be written down for people to see from generation to generation. So that's kind of the power of the Code of Hammurabi. Not that there hadn't been rules before, but this is really the first written law code, and it's widely distributed throughout the kingdom. And we'll also see this connected to various forms of literature that will emerge. So here you can see the kind of impressions placed. Now, how does writing really develop? In kind of a broad sense, from early antiquity, we have symbols that correlate to things that we see. Now, if you look at the graph there, you can see in 3200 BCE that the shapes really correspond to things that we might even say are true, right? They depict things that seem like the objects they are, right? So head, for example, looks like a head, or to walk looks like a leg, or barley looks like some kind of barley. So this makes sense. Somewhere around 3000 BCE, it's kind of placed on its side or inverted. And then over time, it's stylized to detach itself. But you can really see the evolution of these marks and how they come to symbolize the same sort of symbols that early on depicted them. But they are symbolic, they are symbols, and they are not phonetic in any true sense. The phonetic system will be developed much later, but the idea here is that each kind of symbol corresponds to particular concepts or words. Now, this, of course, leads to writing, but opens the doors for more than just legal or economic or even necessarily religious writings, but for literature. Writing made it possible for people to communicate ideas in this new way, and this can be evidenced by the famous Epic of Gilgamesh, the story of Gilgamesh and his buddy Enkidu as they set out on an adventure to find immortality. And so it's a compelling story, and most people have to read it in school. It was a narrative penned thousands of years ago, and is quite compelling, and served a political purpose, served a religious purpose, no question. But it has a literary quality to it that is completely different than what had come before. And so we really see the opening of the written word into a new kind of spectrum of life. Now, also, the Sumerians have a new approach to technology, as we've seen before, obviously with the will and its connection to economics. The technology will really be one of the central foci of how this civilization really blossoms. The Sumerians were the first to really make bronze out of copper and tin, and to export that for economic gain. And this, of course, leads to very fine metalwork and craftsmanship. So the people there will develop incredible, beautiful pieces that many people will long for. But the ability to do this and to create the wheel and to create the arch and the dome really required a skilled ideal toward mathematics, toward astronomy, and really a knowledge of the various areas of study that they needed to kind of master these disciplines. So our objectives were, 1, explain how geography affected the civilization in Mesopotamia, and 2, describe Sumerian city-states and Sumerian forms of communication that affect our lives today.